the interesting part is you talk about Charlie and how intelligent he was, and he was one of the most phenomenal human beings to ever live. But you also made the point last time we spoke, and Candace maybe not so much included in terms of intelligence and depth, but Megyn Kelly, clearly smart. Tucker Carlson, clearly very smart. And maybe it is just the financial factor that motivates them. But if it's not, if they've also been able to be kind of tricked or coerced or indoctrinated, then anyone's vulnerable, really, aren't they?
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes me think about some of what made Charlie such an admirable person. Charlie was suspicious of everybody. But not in a conspiratorial way, but meaning he took everything. He was always measuring everything, and he wanted to hear from different voices. This is how I ended up as part of his life, right? He wanted to, he heard from those voices. He wanted to make sure he had someone on the ground in Israel that he could talk to, and he was always seeking people who knew more than him. He had a number of people in his life who were older than him, who were mentors on different topics and different areas of his life that he was constantly consulting with. There was a certain humility in that. He didn't think he had it all figured out. Yeah. And that's part of what made him who he was. But yeah, listen, people are vulnerable, especially when you end up at a young age having access. When you have access, you feel like you're getting inside information. Like when Candace says, I have information all the way from the top in the intelligence community, she's actually telling the truth. Because if the head of counterintelligence is telling her that this ridiculous conspiracy theory has validity, she feels very much justified in saying that it does.
Yeah. And emboldened, doesn't she? And in some ways, the role that he's played in so much pain and suffering is significant. No. And does he get held to account? We'll wait and see. I guess in a moral way or a religious way, we all do eventually, don't we, get held to account. Speaking of Christian Zionism, Rabbi, you're fired up. Can you explain this to me? I'm a good Catholic girl, but probably not as good a Catholic girl as I should be.
This goes right into the Joe Kent conversation because, Joe and Candace and this, what's her name? Carrie?
Jean, yeah. The beauty queen.
Yeah, exactly. The Catholic who was harassing.
Jean.
She was harassing Shabbos Kestenbaum at that hearing. That's how she made her fame. That's how she got her 7 minutes. So there's something interesting that's happened in our political discourse about Israel over the last really maybe half a year mainly, which is that the whole issue of Christian Zionism and the theological attack on it coming from a lot of Catholics, but not only Catholics, coming from Christians who view Christian Zionism as a kind of heresy and are kind of doubling down. And part of this, what makes it really dark, is part of the messaging, and you hear it from Tucker a lot and from Candace a lot, is that the Jews of today aren't the real Jews. You've heard this before, I'm sure. Yeah. Right? You hear this, and I find it actually a fascinating claim. I actually find it very interesting because, and what makes it so interesting, here's what makes it really interesting, is that it's brand new. Let me explain what I mean. If you go back to, let's say, Martin Luther, who lived in the 16th century, okay, hated Jews, despised them. He wrote a whole book called On the Jews and Their Lies, okay, despised Jews. But he never claimed that the Jews of his time were not the real Jews. He absolutely acknowledged that they were. There are lots of Jew haters throughout history, a lot of Jew haters in the name of Jesus throughout history. But they didn't claim that the Jews of their time period weren't the real Jews.
Such a good point.
It's a brand new claim. Now, let me explain why they're doing it. So I thought about this because I encountered this. I'll tell you a quick story. I was once invited to speak, before October 7th, and I got involved in a lot of more political messaging and advocating on behalf of Israel. My career is really Jewish-Christian relations, a lot of it in the academic space, speaking in churches and Christian seminaries. I have relationships with Christian theologians and leaders. And I was once invited to speak at a Presbyterian church in the state of Wyoming. And that's very unusual because the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, the PCUSA, is very anti-Israel. They support BDS. They're very, very anti-Israel. But there was this There was this one Presbyterian pastor, a woman out in Wyoming, and she wanted to have me speak at her church, to hear our side. And she asked permission from the state presbyter of Wyoming to have this event. And he didn't want to say yes, but he also didn't want to say no to a pastor of one of his churches and then have a disgruntled pastor. So he reluctantly allowed her to host me. And he sent her an email allowing her to host me and also saying that it had to be recorded. The recording had to be sent to him. There was all these stipulations. But the opening line of his email to her was, he said, "I want to make my position clear. I do not equate the Jewish people of today with the biblical nation of Israel." That was his opening line. Wow. And she showed me the email. I don't think he thought she'd show me the email. And she showed me the email, and I thought to myself, that's so interesting. Like, this is really a brand new thing. And then I looked into it, and I realized it's a claim that's only surfaced in the last few decades. So why? So it's very simple, actually. The classic Christian doctrine of the Jews is what's called supersessionism, or replacement theology. And that was the dominant view of all Christians from Augustine's time until today. For most of that time, Christians believed that the church had replaced Israel, that the Jewish people had lost their covenant, right? And everyone knows that. Yeah. But it really became a popular doctrine because Augustine, who's probably the most influential Christian theologian, maybe of all time, arguably one of the most, he embraced this, but he explained it as follows. He said that the Jewish people are like Cain, who killed his brother and was then a wanderer for the rest of his life. So too the Jewish people, for killing Jesus, are destined, and he also based it on a verse in Psalms. There's a whole passage in his book, The City of God, where he explains this, that the Jews are destined to be scattered and powerless in exile forever as a witness, to bear witness to the consequences of rejecting Jesus. Okay? And that became the dominant theology of the Catholic Church, and that's the way most Christians believed. And even in the Protestant circles where they embraced other forms of supersessionism, it was all kind of built on this construct that Augustine had formulated. What's the problem? The problem is that when you make an assertion like that, an eschatological assertion that the Jewish people will be in exile forever, and meanwhile the Jews at the time are saying, well, yeah, we've been in exile for a while, but we believe that we're going to go back one day, someone's going to be right and someone's going to be wrong. It's not like one person believes in the Trinity and one person doesn't, and it never comes to a head. You just have different beliefs. If you're making an assertion about history, let's see what happens. So what happens when the Jewish people, who have an unbroken chain of who we are, it's a totally unbroken chain. We have communal records and books written by Jewish leaders from every single century, almost every generation, going all the way back to temple times. We know exactly who we are and where we've been. The assertion that the Jews of today aren't the real Jews is not held by any legitimate historian because it's completely ahistorical nonsense. It's easy to refute. And that's also what makes this so interesting. That here's the problem that these people are faced with. History progresses, and lo and behold, the Jewish people are ingathered to the land of Israel after thousands of years in exile. We come back to our land from the four corners of the earth, and as the Bible says, even if you are scattered to the ends of the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back to the land of your forefathers, and you will take possession of it and become more numerous and more prosperous than your ancestors. That's Deuteronomy 30. That's the ingathering of the Jewish people. It's then repeated dozens of times. It's the most repeated prophecy in the Bible, okay? And no other nation from the ancient world that went into exile ever came back home. And many, many nations were exiled by invading empires. So the only one that God said it would happen, that nation comes back to the land of Israel. So now, if you believe in Augustine's doctrine, you have a problem. Because if Augustine was alive today, with a prosperous nation of Israel in our homeland, ingathered from the four corners of the earth, he wouldn't have said what he said. Yeah. So you have a problem if you're a Catholic. If you're a Catholic who believes that, if you're a supersessionist, you say, wait a second, what do I do? If I acknowledge that the Jewish people today are the same people from the times of the Bible, then I have to face the fact that the biblical prophecy of their return has happened.
Yeah.
So what do? I either have to adjust my theology, which is what Christian Zionists did. Christian Zionists basically say, "Oh, wait a second. Replacement theology that says that the Jews are never coming back turns out to be wrong. So they've made a change." So all these traditional Catholics look at the Christian Zionists and say, "Hey, that's a brand new idea." And therefore they try to delegitimize it. But what they're actually doing is they're saying, "Hey, wait, we have to adjust." And these traditional Catholics, they can't accept the fact that the Jewish people have returned to their land. So their only way out, their only workaround, is to say that the Jews aren't actually the Jews.
That's incredible. And you're right, because I can't deny the return to the homeland. That's happened. It's
right. So they have to say that we're not actually the Jews. Right.
Yeah. That is, gosh, you're incredible. I'm going